right, maybe we should get going and start. Can you hear me all right from the back? Yeah, all right. I think we think the podium might be on, but whether it is or it isn't, I think I have a sufficiently loud voice. Ruth Nettle is going to talk today, and Professor Nettle is Agriculture Domain Leader in the School of Agriculture and Food, and leads the Rural Innovation Research Group in the School of Agriculture and Food. Ruth completed her honours degree at the University of New England and her PhD at the University of Melbourne. The work of Ruth's research group complements the school's work on climate, environment, soils, plants and animals by focusing on the social science of farming communities. Her research interests include rural workforce development, the role of extension in rural change, multidisciplinary research, development and extension, and change in farming systems, and she provides strategic reviews to government on issues facing rural industries in Australia. Ruth and her research group recently won the 2019 University of Melbourne Award for Excellence in Industry Engaged Research. Right at the beginning, well done to Ruth and well done to that team for getting that award. Ruth.
Thanks very much, John, and it's great to be here to have the opportunity to talk to you about engaged research. What I hope to do today is to talk a little bit about engaged research, what it means to us as a research group, but also what it means to the university and also to agriculture. And I hope my voice holds out. Also, I've got the water here as well. So the context for this discussion and seminar today is what John talked about just then, which is that earlier this year we were recognised with the University of Melbourne Excellence Award for Industry Engaged Research. And actually in a couple of weeks' time we received that award amongst others, including Rachel Carey in our faculty from the Vice-Chancellor. And so some of these are the areas that we as a group over many years have sought to make a contribution to through some current and also past projects. So what we try to do as a group is to generate new knowledge around effective actions for managing change. So it's the science for action, if you will. So in this seminar, I'm going to talk about just a couple of our three of our engaged research projects, but through that talk about what engaged research is, why we do it, and provide some examples of how we do it. But I suppose to talk to you today about what you're involved with in any part of the university is that I'm hoping that what I'll be able to show is how central engaged research is to our faculty and to the university. Secondly, that engaged research comes with particular values, principles and practices that compels us as individuals and the institution to consider the impact of our work in society. And finally, to talk about the contribution that agriculture and agricultural systems thinking and agricultural science actually make to this broader issue for the university, and that's the foundations of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. So to start with then, what do we say engaged research is? So I thought I'd start with what the university says it is. So what it is and why it's important. So from the university's perspective, we see engaged research as research, so it's distinguished from general engagement, that it's research that addresses the social, economic and environmental challenges of our time, that it is about forming partnerships and collaborations, but that's for enriching or improving and applying our research. And it involves active engagement with the public. So we can see that engaged research really is a mechanism around the legitimacy of university research in society. Now, if we have a look at the discussion paper that's out right now in the university, it is the new strategy. And I really encourage everyone to read and comment on it because it's open now and it closes this week. So some of the core words in the strategy document revolve around how important the company that the university keeps is going forward. And this is both the international scholarly community, but also that the university is to be strongly connected to its communities. It talks about translational research, embracing cross-disciplinary work, and that we have to be part of the solution to addressing the knowledge action gap. So it seems that the future in terms of our strategy in the university is pushing more towards what engaged research is seeking to contribute to. Yet we must all acknowledge that it's a struggle, it seems, to really understand what engaged research constitutes and what measures we might use to understand its impact. I've got a sorry for the recording there. So we can see how important it is, and perhaps engaged research might be viewed as a solution to some of the university's general concerns or issues around its future engagement. But we have to also understand that engaged research can be a contested space. So on one hand, from a review of engaged scholarship in universities conducted by Bolu just last year, they speak about how engaged research strengthens the influence of scientific evidence, that it includes knowledge translation, can involve participatory research, involves service users or end users involved in research, and is about public engagement. So you could say these are the positive aspects or the things that engaged research is supposed to achieve. But they also acknowledge some of the concerns and issues around engaged research, and I've listed some of them here. So we know that there's a lot of scrutiny on the nature of industry-funded research, and the sources of funding of research can often be brought into question. We know that there's views that can come in that engagement is just another strand of, or some of the boxes that we have to tick in as being a scholarly community. There's still debates about engaged research and its position around whether it's translational and applied only, and that's quite separate from what might be called pure or basic research. Or that we might consider engaged research as about just communicating better and working with the media. And an Australian author talking about his experience in the University of Queensland says that the engaged research domain has a lot of skeptics, a lot of utilitarians and missionaries for engaged research. Now today I'm hoping not to be any of those three in discussing this, but just to be aware that it's not a straightforward understanding or debate that we can have. So what I'm talking about today is really how do we understand the scholarship of integrating, engaging and applying. And that's what I'm hoping to talk a bit more about today. So we know a bit about what engaged research is. We know a little bit about why it's important, but how do we proceed with it and what's its scope? So I thought I'd start by talking a bit about how we view engaged research and the scope of engaged research. And I want to start with the circles in the centre of the diagram here, on both sides. That we can consider a stylised research process being made up of having research questions and hypotheses drawn out of problems and issues. We can have data collection and analysis, and we have an interpretation step or an application step or consideration of change practices or commercialisation or implications for policy. And we're always future thinking about how we can advance knowledge and practice. So how we look at this is that we start with the first question being, in any research area or problem area, who is it that might be impacted, and or who needs to be involved or will have to be involved in the change that this might bring? And that defines a subset, I suppose, of people that need to be engaged, and also how they might be engaged and where they might be engaged across this process. So for that, it requires to expand the box around research and its impact from the end to the whole of the research process. Now, this requires a number of things. And for this, I'm going to draw from Bolu as well. That says, well, you need engaged scholars. That's the asterisk down the bottom. You need particular values, and they talk about social justice and citizenship, and a number of principles that guide the research process. Research quality, which no one would argue with, but the ideas of reciprocity, focused on an identified need, boundary crossing, and democratisation of knowledge. So these are principles that come with the engaged research scope. And often in our experience, some of the scholarly and other outputs are a result of that process. So we know, or we've covered a little bit about what it is, why it's important, some dimensions of the scope. I now just wanted to talk a little bit about our experience in a number of, or 3 case studies, I suppose, of engaged research from our work. I forgot to mention the other dimension of Bolu's is the institutional support that's needed around engaged scholarship, which I'll come back to at the end. So I've chosen 3 case studies to talk about our engaged research processes and practices that you would say aren't necessarily small in scale nor scope. And so the issues of climate adaptation, the issues of the agricultural workforce, and Australia, in particular Australia's agricultural innovation system. So I want to start with the climate adaptation case. So one of the recognised challenges in the scientific literature around climate change adaptation, and it's quite a good link to Richard's talk from last month on the challenges of climate adaptation in the livestock industries. But one of the key challenges is that often a lot of the research focuses on impacts or ideals around what adaptation should look like. But some of the challenges around how adaptation occurs at the farm scale in particular is issues like trust in climate scenarios and modelling outputs. You might even say an issue can be beliefs in climate change, or that how can we account for extreme events and the risks and uncertainties with extreme events. And a known issue is how to bridge what can be a dissonance between solving or addressing current issues and challenges around climate with future climates. So we, with our colleagues from the faculty, from biophysical sciences, economics, and also social sciences, partnered in projects with the dairy sector and with regional communities in South Australia, Victoria and Tasmania to progress what adaptation might look like for these regions and these farming systems. So in this way, I suppose changing or addressing the knowledge gap around climate adaptation research methods that also support adaptation. So you can see some elements here of a project design, which involves the traditional project steering committee and a project team, and particular inputs and dimensions of the research design. So involved climate scenarios, biophysical and economic modelling, social research. But you'll notice here case study farms, farm development options, and an integrated assessment alongside climate scenarios. We worked directly with farmers and farmer groups as an interdisciplinary team to identify the type of modelling and scenarios that could cope with extreme events and also provide adaptation solutions and options. In this process, the farm development options weren't just produced by the research outputs or the models, but were co-produced with farmers from the different regions around what development options could be, I suppose, imagined in those next 30, 40 years alongside the climate scenarios. And it was this approach that bridged many of these issues on the side. Building trust in climate outputs and modelling outputs, removing belief in climate change as actually a need for being adaptive, addressing critical issues around the management of extreme events, and thinking about the current with the future in mind in farming systems. So this pathway around integrated assessment meant that it was a transdisciplinary knowledge production exercise with farmer knowledge incorporated. This particularly related to timeframes of analysis, the way risk and the range of risks were modelled, and in particular the key finding around the regional possibilities being quite different for, in this case, dairy farms. And an example of some of the development options modelled, discussed and produced with that interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary team are shown just for one region here at the bottom of the slide. So you might say that's a nice story of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, but what were the impacts of this process? On farm, those people involved resonated with not only the findings and felt that they'd made a contribution to the outcomes and the outputs, but had made sense of these findings for their own situation and the changes that they were making in their farm business. But scientifically, there's a number of key outputs. So one from our colleague Brendan Cullen, Matthew Harrison from Tasmania, and Dan Armstrong, the economist, in ag systems, plus new or papers underway around the new methodologies for climate change adaptation research, plus increased trust and engagement of farmers, and now the methodology being of interest in other sectors. So a key, I suppose, message or around engaged research in this case was that engaged research was done by design from the beginning, that the researchers from all those different disciplines were highly active in the process throughout, and there was mutual benefits for science and for the communities and impact in the field. So moving on now to the second case, that of agricultural workforce research. So this is not necessarily a case of engaged research throughout a whole process, but really a way over time our research has contributed to identification of problems and issues and policies and strategies. So quite a fragmented approach, I suppose, to this area. And partly it's because this area receives very limited research funding. And despite being a global issue, is very awkward to sort of really mobilise research and research around. So in that regard, it really depends and focuses back on the researcher, and then knowledge of the disciplinary area and the knowledge of the key issues to mobilise, I suppose, that interest and impact. So I take the example here of some early work around agricultural industries talking about challenges with attracting and retaining, or mainly attracting people into agriculture and into all parts of the agricultural system. And so you can see in policy and by government, and National Farmers Federation, even now, labour and skills shortages, or how do we attract the future workforce. Having begun in this area a long time ago, I had recognised that there was another issue that wasn't really on the table here, and that was around the extent, potentially, of employee turnover. That was actually increasing the demand on needing to attract people because we couldn't keep people in agriculture. But this was just a hypothesis, and it was very hard to get any traction on whether this sort of area could be grown or understood better. So with really no funding, was able to develop a method for measuring and understanding employee turnover and getting that put into a national survey that the dairy sector was doing around employee attraction in the industry. And what we found through the measures and methodology and metrics across a number of years at a national level was measures of separation and accession rate, which is important in workforce issues in agriculture. And we found that not only was the cost of high turnover on farms huge for the sector, valued at about $160 million, but the accession rate, which is the measure of how many people are leaving a sector under stable employment, was shown also to be high. And this was what was doubling the need for attracting people in because they couldn't be kept. And so this was, I suppose, an example of then being able to feed that back in directly to industry policy, which was immediately used to improve work with the industry around their retention strategies. And that work is still going on today with the industry. And this workforce work developed our profile as a group around the only being one of very few researchers to be working in this area in Australia. And from this, the cotton sector and the horticulture sector has started to really come to us in partnership with some of their needs and issues. And so this is just another example of how in the Goulburn Valley area, agricultural workforce issues in horticulture are a very big concern. It's part of the food futures issues with the region. And it was actually through a University Innovation Seed Fund that work by my colleague Michael Santana Martin worked around understanding in detail the issues for employers and employees. And interestingly, this engaged research actually brought in the link with students' teaching and internships because it became a mechanism of interest or a way to address some of the issues around skilled workforce for that region. So engaged research leading to greater engagement around the university. Again, in small research projects, building the university's research interests into part of the solution around workforce in the region, which is now being undertaken, and with Agriculture Victoria. So I suppose what we learn a little about from this case study of engaged research is that it's important around engaged scholarship to keep close to problems of stakeholders and being there to address issues that come up. Sorry. but also it shows the importance of time and how even small contributions have global significance. So this area has now is recognised internationally as the workforce issues, as a key. Sorry, that's missing some slides there of papers. That this work has been able to publish in key scientific journals, Agronomy, Sustainable Development, Sustainability Science, and further international collaborations around the critical issues of workforce and work assessment and work organisation. And coming up next year, another international symposium to really address and feed into these areas. What we've learned from this engaged research approach is that our stakeholders and communities really want to know about the international story. They really want to know what we know about what's going on elsewhere and what solutions are being proposed. Sorry. So we can underestimate how international scholarship is also for our stakeholders and the benefits that can flow from us being international to our communities. So we're often asked, is anything like this happening elsewhere? Are our solutions as good as or better than what's being done elsewhere? So in this engaged research, what we're finding is that time in this research area, small contributions in a very poorly funded area, still has major international significance and benefit to the community. The final case that I wanted to talk about is the research that we're able to do with a number of stakeholders. That was the first time in well over a decade that the advisory and extension system in Australia, alongside research and development, was considered as a research endeavour. Now, I like to say that logos can be deceiving in terms of engagement and the level of engagement. So this looks fantastic, I suppose, although someone always says, oh, but our research project had 15 RDCs, not 6 as here. And so you can say, well, of course this is engaged research. We have 6 rural development corporations, we have 2 state governments, and we were the lead researchers for this particular work. And this is highly significant to the future of Australia's research, development and extension system, which is currently under review. And currently there's a discussion paper open from the Minister's office around this area. So through this engagement and collaboration, we were able to conduct the first empirical research in over 10 years of the issues. But what it really meant was really improved research from our end. A key challenge in social science often is adequate sample sizes. And so it's actually through our engagement we're able to work through those stakeholders and our other networks to really raise the importance of this issue amongst farmers and advisors across Australia. And here I just give a snapshot of the farmers and advisors engaged in that project. So here it was a help to the quality of science from that engagement, to be able to make serious contributions to policy and to understanding of the system and what was working or not. So for instance, one of the things that we're able to do was look at farmers' use of different information advice sources in their farm management. Here is just one of the examples that's based out of Farm Size, which shows that independent advisors, which is the middle yellow, were highly significant sources of information and advice that are quite separate from the R&D system generally, and that smaller farms actually used a whole range of other sources of advice. So this is really significant for researchers in Australia. If you're trying to engage directly with farmers around the impacts or influence of your research, you have to go through these groups generally. And it's not just one organisation that is going to be part of your pathway to impact. But it was from this type of research output that we were able to mobilise private sector advisors to look at the critical issue facing agriculture about the use of smart farming technologies and their uptake in farm, and work with the private sector who are working directly with farms. And so that took us into a range of collaborative trials with different advisors. And we're able to work in the smart farming space with these different organisations on a pre-competitive basis. And out of that showed that the sharing of resources that comes from collaboration was able also to share the risks involved with a lot of failure around the usefulness of ag tech on farm at the moment. It aligned the effort across scales because this also involved the rural development corporations and their investment. And it created a lot of spin-offs around new opportunities in the areas of smart farming. And it had a direct impact on the advisors and farmers involved in that trial. And out of that was a decision support tool. This is work done by my colleague Margaret Eyre around digital agriculture investment for farm advisory firms, and the scientific output being published in the Wageningen Journal of Life Sciences. So I've covered sort of 3 quick cases of different types of engagement in engaged or engaged research. And there's a number of insights that come from those cases. And I think one of the insights that I'd like to emphasise is that some of this you can see now perhaps the key performance indicators that might be associated with engaged research. Research quality is still absolutely central and is part of what comes from engaged research. So engaged research is the and. We have quality science, we have quality outputs. We have a number of engagement events a year. As a group, we counted them up for the award, that it's thousands of events over our history. That with this brings return on involvement. It's a different way of thinking about return on investment, that our involvement is an investment with communities, but we get a return on that and they get a return on it. So some of those returns have been measured capacity building amongst the community and advisors in a particular topic or area, direct and measurable impact that not only we can attribute, but others attribute to us. We have non-academic partners as co-authors. We can measure stakeholder satisfaction and with involvement with us. And we can look at how investment happens over time as key measures of our engaged research. So I'm sure it's time to wrap up and have questions. In conclusion, how I see engaged research and its contribution to agriculture and the university is that engaged research is actually about mutual and reciprocal bridges between the university and society. And that means that problems, when we engage and do research in an engaged way, problems are presented in new ways and innovative solutions are legitimised. And this means that it's a way for useful, meaningful and transformative impact over time. So engaged research is central to the university's future mission and the discussion and strategy at hand. I still see that researchers are the heart of engagement processes, and agricultural science and its foundations, with the strong participatory, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary processes, mean that the faculty and the university are well placed to draw on this for that future mission. but doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to happen swimmingly. I still see some remaining issues. We must ask that if engaged research is fundamental to the university mission, then it's not only a strategy to be adopted by some, but fundamental and integral to research strategy overall. It is acknowledged in the literature, and we would also acknowledge it ourselves, that it requires a broader range of scholarly skills. So the discussion paper talks about convening as a convening. The convening is the way that we establish further and greater legitimacy, but facilitation and design are also other skills. What I've described to you are some cases that have had quite long lead times, not just around impact, but for developing relationships. And so this means that it has to build this for the future. We need to bring early career researchers and others along and have mechanisms by which this is supported. So I'd say that for further engaged research, it means also greater institutional support alongside an individual's portfolio of skills and interests. So I hope today this short overview of engaged research, what it is, why it's important, how we've done it, and I know many of you are engaged in research in this way. I hope this has provided some thoughts, insights, stimulation for new ways of thinking about engaged research and what the challenge is for us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I take it you're prepared to take some questions if your voice holds out?
Yep.
All right. I like the way you put it in the context of the University 2030 strategy and engaged research, and it's true that the Vice-Chancellor talks about that a lot, so I think that's very appropriate. Let me, well, actually I don't have to start, I have a question, but let's see, does anybody else have a question? So, Richard.
Ruth, thank you for the presentation. The last point you had there, universities tend to struggle with the metrics of how to actually measure and recognise engagement, don't they? You know, I got the impression that when the university talks about engagement, they talk about talking to the chief executive of BHP. That's not what you're talking about here.
No. Good. Tick.
How do we, how would you see us including those engagement metrics as part of evaluation of academic performance? You know, we know how to measure peer-reviewed papers, we know how to measure ground income. How do we measure engagement?
The only way I can answer that really is what we do as a group, and we specifically measure those things that I mentioned. All the way through our research. So we ask our stakeholders these particular questions. We really like it when industries invest in cost-benefit analyses. That also can help attribute. So I think you're right that the university doesn't deal very well around engaged research metrics. But these are some indicators of what we try and measure, because we're about continuous improvement. So we need to be understanding what direct impacts our research is having, what the impact has been in these multiple benefits, and so we have to do it ourselves. So that was the evidence that we're able to put forward for the Excellence Award. But that's not enough.
Yeah, please.
Yes, Ruth. You mentioned that there's been a dearth of investment in the study of the workforce in terms of retention and translation. Why is that? When you've got is it because it hasn't been demonstrated that there's a $38,000 per employee cost per person? Why are the industries not
investing? Gosh, have you got a day? In summary, research and development in our agricultural industries in Australia have really focused on the productive system, as in the land, water and capital investment, I suppose. I suppose the people aspect has always been seen as not an area of research and development in general. So why we had, it was my PhD that began some of this for dairy many, two or more decades ago. What generally happens is as farm scale expands, there's greater interest, and then it's decisions of boards to say we will allocate a slice of the pie to understanding people, capability and leadership areas. Sometimes that doesn't go into research and development. Yeah. The other reason is that it's one of the areas that fits in the public good, because it's about education, skills, future development and private, and I think partly it's stuck there. So what you find is when things are in the public and private realm, not everyone points to the other person and says it's the public or it's the private. Other countries don't suffer from this. So particularly in Europe, where there's a much broader view of agricultural policy and agricultural R&D that looks at social sustainability, looks at workforce dynamics. So we've still got a way to go.
Can I pick up on Jeremy's question? Because I was thinking about that as well. And so you go out there, you do a piece of research, and you have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis says there's a turnover in agricultural workers, and this is contributing to the shortage. And then you find that there is. You do the research, and you find that there is. How far does your research go? Do you then go to the next level and go, and solutions to that would be, and do you come up with solutions as well in these? You were showing us some documents.
Yep. Yes.
And what kind of solutions are then implemented?
Yes, so in that case, that was at a time that I was actually jointly funded by Dairy Australia, and they were also deciding to invest in that area. And so I was able to work directly with advisors, farmers, stakeholders, dairy companies, around their human resource management practices on farm, tools and resources, and capacity building of advisors. So now in that area there's 130 advisors that are HR specialists to support farmers in improving their employment management, which is part of increasing retention, which is then part of reducing the burden on attraction, which is then part of having farming systems that suit people, which is about redesign of farming systems, which improves climate change adaptation, which helps social sustainability of farming. So it's partly is a story about engagement and engaged research there about sustainable impacts over time.
Thank you. Other questions? Greg?
So Ruth, we're obviously heavily engaged as a university, both through the academics and the support staff, engaged in research, translation and commercialisation. Do you think we should be more actively engaged in extension as a whole university, but particularly this faculty? Do you think the differences in those definitions are meaningful in this current environment?
I think universities aren't, in Australia, really struggle to do that because of the funding models. So it's often, it's been proposed over many decades that universities have that role, but people are always drawing off the land grant model from America when they say that, and the types of appointments in America under the land grant system. That comes from a particular history and a particular investment of government, which we have nothing like that in Australia. So therefore it's always at the cost of other things if we are to do it. So I don't see the question as being should we do it. Okay, sometimes you might say what I've just described to you has extension elements. I think more critical to the question is about whether we're always going to wait to the end of research to engage. And I think that's the problem. Because we've shown other impacts that flow when you have engagement from the beginning and throughout in a designed process. So I think overall what we need to do is ramp up the way the institutes in the university are trying to operate across faculty and to certain issues. We need to link that better with business development the business development, and we need to have programs of effort that enable researchers to come in and be part of those communities. That's some examples of how you take that into the strategy going forward.
So Ruth, I was in Canberra last week, and I had the opportunity to speak to the Minister for Vocational Training and also Dan Tian, the Minister for Higher Education. And they were talking about how the university sector and the TAFE sector needed to get closer. And in fact, there was an announcement a couple of days later, nothing to do with my visit, but just them saying that the two needed to get closer. And do you think there are opportunities for us there, following on from Greg's question? Should we be getting closer to TAFE? Go TAFE is right next to Dookie.
Yes, I know. They do work at Dookie as well.
Yeah.
For what purpose?
Maybe some of this engaged research that around attitudes of the farming community to. I know you work on adaptation of technology. I mean, maybe we could partner with them with that.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose it's in all areas. It's always things are fit for purpose, and so in fact, it is the TAFE and University Connect. That's starting to grow more in the area of smart farming and precision agriculture as one avenue. And there's a couple of things around that. One is that often the maintenance of particular new technologies requires quite sophisticated trades. And so partly it's a greater connection between the trades that are done in vocational education and sort of farm services. Also, for some farmers that are entering, or for some parts of the workforce that are entering the area of smart farming, I suppose the one-day workshop or the short-term focus that some TAFEs are getting actively involved with. For instance, Tocal in New South Wales are doing that for Bird Chip Cropping Group in the Wimmera Mallee. So I think definitely through partnerships there, vocational and tertiary, and also for particular problems and issues, it's about boundary crossing, isn't it? With all areas, we've got to be thinking of new boundaries and new collaborators. But perhaps, John, it's why I got a call from Bridget McKenzie's office after you'd been there.
Okay.
Because they would like me to be on the National Agricultural Workforce Strategy Development or something.
I did talk to her as well.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for Ruth?
Have you got a question, Herbert?
All right. Well, Ruth, if there's no other questions,
Early mark.
please join me in thanking Ruth again.
Thank you.